Hey family, this is David Mahan, Policy Director here at CCV. This is what's coming up on this episode of The Narrative.
And I think this is where a lot of Christians go wrong. When you read the accounts of people like Carl F. H. Henry and Francis Schaeffer, when they're talking about communism, they're not talking about a different political party. They're not even talking about a different governmental system like a monarchy or an aristocracy or something like that. They're talking about a fundamental worldview, an all-encompassing worldview that's hostile, overly hostile. And when you read when they talk about these things, people look back at the Cold War Christians and say, oh, they got carried away, they were just being nationalistic. It's like, no. When you read what they said, they didn't oppose communism because communism fought America. They supported America because America fought communism. It was the reverse.
Right.
They didn't see the opposite number of communism to be the United States. They saw the opposite of communism to be Christianity. It was a completely rival system.
Always honest, often blunt, and never afraid. This is The Narrative. My name is Aaron Baer, and I'm the president of Center for Christian Virtue. Here with my co-host David Mahan, who's our policy director here at CCV. We're jumping into volume 2 of The Narrative. Last volume, we got into the topic of race and had some amazing discussions with leaders from all over the country, unpacking and debunking some of the myths around the racial narratives in America today from a Christian worldview perspective. We're looking forward to doing that in volume 2 with you. And on this topic, we're going to dive into Marxism. This is one of those issues. As we were thinking about where we wanted to go, there was a lot of different directions, but so much the undercurrent of the things that are dividing us today. And we even saw this pop out in volume 1, has its roots in Marxism. And so we really wanted to jump deeper into this topic, bring in some people who are experts from all over the world, who are seeing a Marxist worldview really wreak havoc on folks, whether it's in Cuba or China or even here in America today. The first guest we're going to have for this first episode is a guy named Tim Padgett, who's with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and we're going to kind of give a big picture, compare and contrast between a Christian worldview and a Marxist worldview. And I think what you're going to find is there's so much more to Marxism than what most folks think as we jump into this. But before we get to that interview with Tim, David, good to see you, man. How was summer? How are you doing? Any parting thoughts on volume 1 before we jump into volume 2?
No, I loved it, and as I said before, it was great to hear from such great folks, just their perspectives on race historically. Just by the numbers was a big episode of hearing that. I had a great summer though. Put all that away, went to Puerto Rico, spent a few days in paradise with all the family, all 6 of us together. And God just lavished us. There's wild horses running around everywhere. It was amazing, man. And then I came back to work.
then he had to come back to the mines here. So pray for David. It's a tough life he lives. But let's jump into sort of current events. What's going on today? There's a lot to catch up on. Some of these things are stories or things that have been happening for weeks that I've just been dying to jump on and talk with you all about. But the one that just keeps on, like, I feel like every day there's a new angle on it. Because I think the bottom line on it is that nobody really knows what was going on is Bishop Sycamore, the Bishop Sycamore story, which for our Catholic listeners out there, you're all very familiar with the great
one of the world's bishops,
the great Bishop Sycamore of the saint of football, apparently, or something. I don't know. This was, for those of you who haven't seen this, it's a story out of Columbus that made national news of a football program that some people thought was a school, but really just a football program that for 3 years had been operating in Ohio, and showed up out of nowhere and started competing against the biggest high school football teams in the state. And then leading to sort of the culmination of a couple weeks ago, they got a nationally televised game. Yeah, on ESPN. And they and got smoked. Mm-hmm. The team just got blown out by one of the top high school football teams in the country. And to the point where, like, the ESPN commentators were feeling awkward about it. And we're like, this isn't safe. Yeah. We don't know how this happened.
They were sharing equipment. People were getting hurt.
Yeah.
And it was 58-0 was the score,
Yeah.
the final score. And I think the year before they ended up 0-6, and apparently somebody paid them a little bit. A promoter paid them to play.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the squad IMG. So.
Yeah. So this it blows up, and then all of a sudden it starts out. How did this happen? Who are these? Who is this school? It turns out they're not even really a school. They're just. Well, they're saying they're a school, but they're like the kids aren't actually going to school. Maybe they're going to the libraries from time to time. Like they were in existence for 3 years, and the more and more that was coming out, eventually, our governor called for an investigation in them, and it's just these kids were recruited from all over the country to come join this program that didn't actually exist.
Yeah, some of them were 18, but some of them were 19, 20. One of them had a child. Originally, they had 10 coaches and ended up, kind of whittling down to just 2, one of which was the founder. And initially, when they were looking at where this school is, they had one address that was at the Chillers skate rink over in Easton. And
which is a suburb of Columbus.
Right. And one was, Franklin University. But, it was funny. They kind of cornered the founder, Andre Peterson. They cornered him, and he actually said it is a school, that we are, taking care of the academic needs of our kids. And then it wasn't until just recently, the new coach or whatever said, no, we're not a school. So nobody really knows what's going on there, except that they do have $110,000 worth of hotel fees that they racked up. And then the latest hotel fees are still not paid. So nobody really knows what's going on there.
Yeah, well, and so there's the kind of like audacious side of this. Like apparently already Kevin Hart and some people are saying they want to do like a documentary on this. Of course, like I think this is the quickest turnaround from scandal to documentary because it feels like it's made for TV. But the thing the reason why we want to talk about this is not just because it's a crazy story, but what from the moment this thing hit, especially people who oppose school choice. They jumped on this and said, see, this is why we can't have school choice. This is this is unaccountable. How did this happen? And what I was saying from the get-go, and what I appreciated about what this other coach said, even though I don't believe much of what he says, is that this is not a school. This is not a school story. This is a football story.
Right.
And look, I'm really excited. I'm a Packers fan. Really excited for the football season coming up. I'm actually a true American, like football, and like David, who likes to go in the woods.
Get outside.
I don't know what he does, but
what's wrong with these kids.
I love football, but anybody, especially folks growing up in the Midwest, we have to be able to acknowledge there's a toxic football culture, and especially a toxic football culture in the cities that targets young, primarily African American boys who are stud athletes and exploit them for their skills. And then the minute that they're no longer, useful to them, they get tossed aside. I saw this growing up in Warren, Ohio. We were a big football program there. I saw this time and time again of kids, some who ended up going to the D1 or going pro, who make it big. But then the moment that their skill starts falling off, nobody wants them anymore. And they just get pushed through school. They get pushed through college if they make it that far, but they never get any life skills. And then on the other side, once they no longer can dunk or they can no longer throw a pass or catch a pass, they get tossed aside and they've got no life skills to actually deal with the road ahead. And that to me is like maybe one of the more egregious examples of that exploitation. But
it just happened faster.
Yeah.
It just happened faster. These kids left. One kid was from Cincinnati. He got here. They were staying in a hotel up in Delaware, Ohio. And he said, they weren't eating. They were having to dine and dash, and just things weren't coming out right. And he finally said, "What am I doing?" He said, "Not studying was fun at first, but he said, what am I doing?"
Yeah.
And he left.
Yeah, and that's again, and that's one. So there's that side of the exploitative football culture. I just want to real quickly on the school choice side, and this is one of the things that quite frankly really ticked me off about this story in particular was. So Bishop Sycamore, really, we're talking 40 to 50 kids that got wrapped up in this over the last 3 years that were really hurt and exploited, and it's terrible. And this is getting all the headlines. This is getting all the attention. But Bishop Sycamore never got $1 of taxpayer money. was a very isolated and unique case where you had a handful of really good hucksters taking advantage of people and exploiting kids in a bad situation. And so now this is getting all the attention in the press here, and they're really bashing these schools for it. However, meanwhile, while all this is going on, Columbus Public here in largest school district in the state of Ohio gets nearly $1 billion every year from the taxpayers. $800 million. They get $22,000 per kid. They start the school year off and they have to shut down 20 of their schools, not because of COVID, but because their air conditioning wasn't
Can't afford air conditioning.
And so just like, and the thing about it is, this is after these kids have been blocked out of getting an in-person education for 18 months. And where was the governor put a statement out about Bishop Sycamore? Great. Where was the statement on Columbus Public? Far more kids were hurt by that. Far more kids were failed by Columbus Public's ongoing failures and a lot of these school districts' ongoing failures. Yeah. And they get all this money from taxpayers, and we've just come to accept that level of failure.
Oh yeah, it happens every year. I went to school in Columbus, public district, and it happens every year. Somebody's shutting down because it's too hot in the building. So this didn't take anybody by surprise. It might be the first time we're hearing about it in the news since the kids were off for so long. But every year these kids are missing education. And when you're looking at how much money they're bringing in as a district every year, even per pupil, it's like, why can't we afford air conditioners knowing that this has been a problem for several decades?
Well, the funny thing was we were talking with one individual who works in Columbus Public, and they said, well, not all the air conditioning was down. The air conditioning in the administrative offices were still working.
All right.
But just
not everybody was sweating. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's, again, it's just... People, we need to address what happened with Bishop Sycamore. It was a terrible situation, and there needs to be more investigation into it. But make no mistake, one, this is a football story, and two, far more egregious things are happening every day on the taxpayer dime in the public education system that people just don't talk about. Sorry, we went a little bit longer on that one, but that one was built up that I want to talk about. Next one to dive into is the Texas abortion law. Again, this is another one that every day there seems to be more news going on about it. For those of you who haven't seen, Texas's heartbeat bill went into effect because of the novel way that they wrote it. That said, basically, there is no state enforcement of this. This is private individuals can bring causes of action against people who perform or aid in the performance of an abortion or an individual getting an abortion. And again, of course, I think what we're really seeing in this situation now, because it caught so many people by surprise, we're really seeing the beginning of what the backlash is going to look like when we overturn that Roe. Not if, when we overturn Roe. We're beginning to get that first taste of what it's going to be like when Roe's overturned. David, you and your wife have worked in the pro-life movement for a number of years. You guys you benefited from the pro-life movement early on in your relationship. What was when you saw all the news out of Texas? What was your first thoughts?
My perspective is one of just the bleeding hearts that they care so much for these women that it's not going to ban abortion, it's banning safe abortion. And so these women are going to go out and it's the most vulnerable. This is the language that I'm hearing so often, is that it's the most vulnerable, meaning the black and brown women who are going to suffer the most. And I'm thinking, since when are babies not the most vulnerable in society? And it's like, when did we not care about all? I'm hearing them talk about all of these women, and I'm thinking about, what about all these babies? It's also sometimes when, you'll hear on like public radio, whatever, they'll be talking about infant mortality and things like that. And, how many, disproportionately, how many black and brown babies are dying, and then I'm thinking these are the same ones who just a month before were advocating for abortion. And so just, I don't know, out of the terminology, the language that's being used to kind of stand against this ban in Texas, it just is blowing my mind. My wife and I were talking about it just a couple nights ago.
Yeah, and again, for us, I think what even that right there is again sort of highlighting when when the final shoe drops on Roe and we get the chance to really start saving babies, it's going to be up to us to be telling the stories of the reality of how these bills are saving lives and the children that are now with us, and the blessing that is. It's also an opportunity for us to love on the women in these situations that would be abortion minded.
Yeah, and I think we need to start telling some stories now. I think a lot of times the argument that you hear about pro-choice, pro-life stuff is that, where is the concern for lives now? What about the lives that are here now? What are you doing for them? It's like all these pregnancy centers, they're not just telling people, giving pregnancy tests. They're offering clothes, they're training, they're doing fatherhood classes. I've participated in many of them. They need to be telling the story of all the services that they're providing to the community right now. The babies, mothers and fathers and babies that are being born and being they're helping to take care of these babies now. I mean, there's actual babies that have my wife's name, over the years from, just the influence that she had on that mother's life.
That's awesome.
Those stories need to be told now.
That just reminds me of one of my favorite things. I remember there was you hate to see when an evangelical goes woke and in all sense lose their minds, and they lose all their sense along the way. And there was one prominent evangelical who made a comment about the March for Life, and was like, oh, I wish these people put as much time in fighting to overturn Roe as they did. They put as much time into fighting for women and babies as they did fighting to overturn Roe. And I was like, do you realize 75% of the people at March for Life all work at pregnancy centers.
That's right. In the community.
That's the pro-life movement is primarily people working in pregnancy centers, helping babies, helping
primarily
moms.
Supported by the church.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such a nonsense. Talk about a nonsense narrative. The narrative around the pro-life movement only caring about babies until they're born.
Right.
Literally, the entire infrastructure is built around helping the moms, and then once they bring their baby to term, helping them raise that child. It's nonsense. Third one quickly here, David, and this is one again from last week, but a really important one. This one jumped out to us, and it had an Ohio angle in particular, but really there were 20 states that were involved with this. 20 states attorneys general, so that's the plural attorney general, not attorney generals, just for those that don't know grammar as well as me.
He's looking at me, to be honest with all you.
And I'm also looking at Claire over here, she's our grammar guru, and I got to train her up on that one, which I got one
back to
grammar
paradise.
Right. So 20 states attorneys general brought a lawsuit against the Biden administration Department of Education for a policy that the Obama administration had, except they just put it on steroids. And this was the policy that says, if a boy says he's a girl, he's allowed to use girls' facilities. If a boy says he's a girl, he's allowed to play in girls' sports, and vice versa. All of the transgender policies that they put in place. But what jumped out at me this time that I didn't realize when we knew this policy went into effect was one of the first things the Biden administration did when they came in. But what jumped out when I saw that our state attorney general Dave Yost joined the lawsuit was that the Biden administration policy went even further on things like pronoun usage, and saying that you as a school, a public school, could lose federal funding if they're not forcing one student to use another student's quote unquote preferred pronouns. And the speech implications on that are massive, but this is one of these things, for those of you who track with CCV, and we talked about this last volume as well, on the school choice side, when people say, is this crazy, transgender LGBT ideology stuff happening in schools? David, you saw this, but the answer is yes. And this policy is all you need to know that it's happening.
It's definitely happening. I remember when Obama tried this and we kind of squashed it. So many times these things go under the radar. You don't ever hear about orders like this, especially when which is crazy because it's coming down from the top, from the president's office. But it's also crazy that most people don't hear about the situations that are coming up in the classroom. If a parent's not sitting in the back of that classroom, if they're not, simply asking for a curriculum list is no longer enough. They're bringing in speakers, they're bringing in, YouTube videos, different presentations that kids, I was reading just the other day, a group from California, a teacher from California was having folks going to a rally, and then they had to write a little, paragraph on that for extra credit. You can't just look for curriculum anymore. If you're not sitting in that classroom, if a kid's not reporting what's going on, or you don't have a teacher in the mix that is relaying this information, it's almost impossible to know. And so I am thankful for Yost in this case, for once again Ohio standing and pushing against some of this overreach.
Exactly. And again, the bottom line here for me is you might be thinking this couldn't happen in my town. No, it's happening in your school.
Definitely happening.
And it's mandated by the federal government. And and don't get me wrong, most of these schools aren't sad about that. It gives them cover to do this thing, but it's pretty egregious, and so this is the time to stand. So, we're going to take a quick break here and come back with our first interview in this volume on Marxism with Tim Padgett from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. So don't go anywhere.
Center for Christian Virtue seeks the good of our neighbors by advocating for public policy that reflects the truth of the gospel. We empower people like you to have a voice in the culture on the most important political and cultural issues of the day. Through our public policy advocacy, grassroots activism, Church Ambassador Network, Ohio Christian Education Network, and Christian Business Partnership, there are countless ways for you to get involved. Join the movement today by visiting ccv.org or by clicking the link in the show notes. That's ccv.org and click Join the Network.
Stories are a way we relate to one another. It's hard to underestimate their importance. Wessler Media is here to help you preserve those stories that you hold dear. We'll produce a personal podcast, an audio scrapbook that will preserve those memories for generations to come. Get in touch today. Call toll-free or text 1-833-38-STORY, 1-833-38-STORY, or visit WesslerMedia.com. That's WESSLER media.com.
And welcome back to The Narrative. This is Aaron Baer, president of Center for Christian Virtue, here with my co-host, David Mahan, our policy director, jumping into our first interview for Volume 2 on Marxism and sort of the clashing worldviews of Marxism and Christianity. And grateful, when you're talking worldview, you think Colson Center for Christian Worldview first and foremost. And we have a really special guest here with us for this first conversation where we really want to lay the groundwork of our deeper dive into Marxism. And we have Dr. Tim Padgett, who is the resident theologian at Colson Center and Breakpoint.org. His focus is on cultural engagement, living out the Christian worldview, and the way Christians argue for diverse viewpoints while sharing a common biblical foundation, particularly regarding the relationship between church and state, Christ and culture, and war and peace. He's the author of Swords and Plowshares and also the editor of Dual Citizens, and has just been a great blessing to the church in really helping us today understand the undercurrents of the things going on. And it's such a perfect guest. So Tim, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. It's always fun to be able to talk about the things that you enjoy and you study. It's like, throw me in that briar patch, let's talk about worldviews. Let's talk about foreign policy. That's all sorts of fun.
I think, Tim, what I kind of want to do with you is let's start a little bit. Let's define what Marxism is, how you would define it. And then really, this is one of those things where we could probably go really, really far back, but let's kind of develop over maybe the last century or so, where this has come from.
Sure.
To put us in this modern context. So could you define a Marxist worldview for us broadly in broad terms?
Yeah, it almost has to be broad terms because there's kind of very different variations that you end up seeing in culture. You've kind of got 19th century Marxism with Marx himself. And then you've got its, Leninist aspect with the 20th century, the Soviet Union, its Maoist aspect in China that split in the mid-century. And then you've got questions of, cultural Marxism, critical theory, and these are definitely influenced by Marxism. And all of these things are affected by Marx. They very often don't get along with each other to the point of bloodshed with the Russians and the Chinese upon occasion. And even when you think about things of cultural Marxism and critical theory, So many of these things are rooted in postmodernism, which is a rejection, obviously, of modernism. And Marxism is fundamentally modernist in understanding that we have figured it out, that humanity has figured it out. So there's lots to go on there. But in the broadest things, it comes down to, I guess, seeing the fundamental nature of society as being one of a clash of powers, clash of interest groups, of groups being the key thing, not necessarily belief systems that comes into play, but you see the power struggles between men, women. Obviously, with Marx, it starts in almost fundamentally economic terms, socioeconomic terms. Marx looked back at the time before him with the French Revolution, the overthrow of the nobility by the bourgeoisie, and he was looking forward to a time when the bourgeoisie would be overthrown by the proletariat, the farmers and the workers, and that would be the last revolution. And just as time has gone on, this idea, while beliefs change, that view of human society as being about conflict between groups, has been kind of the defining thing. That even without these groups that conflicted with each other, that has been kind of the key things. That society is fundamentally about groups in conflict, and I think that's the simplest way that kind of goes throughout all of these.
So what's really interesting, what you said there, especially about the original Marxist thought and how it interplays with economics. I think for most, when I'm talking with churches, when I'm talking with pastors, the things that I hear most when they think of Marxism or communism is they think of it as just an economic structure, right? So they see any government program and they see, oh, this is government seizing the means of production, government seizing the control of the economy, and that's what Marxism is. It's just an economic perspective. So you kind of compare contrast Marxism with capitalism, and that's the most readily available thing that people will compare it to. I think some folks in the church, but it's much bigger than that, as you just kind of went through. It's much broader than that.
Right.
Can you speak into that a little bit of why a lot of folks in the church think of it as an economic only worldview or economic only system, and how it's actually much wider than that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that people do that because it starts out that way. I mean, he starts out the mid-19th century and kind of a philosopher of economics. It starts that way, but it's kind of one of those things that it doesn't stay that way, because he didn't simply, he analyzed economic trends. He analyzed the way societies traded goods, the way societies interacted with one another. But the difference between him and say just your standard economist is that he had kind of an evangelistic zeal and an exhortative zeal. A sense that it's not merely something to understand, but something from that understanding to go forth and do likewise. There really is. I mean, there's a reason that people refer to communism or Marxism as a Christian heresy, because it adopts so much of the concepts, the lingo, the emphases of these things. So it kind of, yes. The short answer is yes. They think of it in that way because it starts that way, and also because it's comfortable to think of it that way. It's comfortable as something that, well, we can just adapt this. Okay, what is communism? Well, community, let's share. And that people say that the early church is communistic in that sense. And that's, to me, I've never understood that. But there's a lot of what I would say, like one of my analogies for that kind of thing is that's like, Boy Scouts and Stalin's gulags are similar because they both have camps. It's just a coincidence that these two things are together. There's a fundamental difference between me offering to you my goods. If I have excess wealth and I offer it to you, that is generosity. For the state to come in and take my goods and give them to you, that's not me being generous at all. That's not sharing. There's nothing in common in that sense between communism and Christianity, except the term and kind of the vague concept. It's a forced thing as opposed to a sharing thing, a generosity thing.
It seems so many times that, when you engage in conversation around, Marxism, communism, socialism, folks tend to kind of conflate, one with the other, or, would you kind of break down for us the difference between some of those, socialism
Sure.
versus communism versus Marxism?
Yeah, I mean, Socialism is one of those terms that lately is bandied about with a lot of use, with not a lot of specificity. I find it ironic that both people who advocate for socialism and kind of hardcore libertarians, they both say, well, socialism, the fire department, that's socialism. Making the roads, that's socialism. And they'll both say that. And that's nonsense. I mean, that is not socialism. Socialism, I would say, is a place where the government, at whatever level, is having significant control of the economic life of a society. And that is broad. It's too much to say that, the fire department makes you socialist. The only people who would say that is like anarchists or socialists. Then the difference between that and communists is this revolutionary aspect. It's this utopian zeal, where socialism is you might say, a manager's perspective on society, that we need to group things together. We need to share things and have the government kind of manage it. With the communists, there is this utopian element. Whether it's the vanguard of the proletariat with Lenin, whether it's with Marx, this inevitable the history being the determining factor. Socialism is kind of on the far left wing of ordinary. You can have that within a democratic society. Now, I don't advise it, but you can have it within a democratic society. With communism, it is inherently not just non-democratic, but anti-democratic, because it fundamentally comes down to an elite who makes all the decisions. One group, it's an aristocracy of the intelligentsia. Instead of having the nobility being in charge of everything, it's the professors, the academics, the eggheads. And so there is a difference. One is a managing, and the other is kind of an utopian zeal ordering. And that makes a big difference, because if you are simply managing, you can still have a place for civil rights and things like that. So for freedom of speech and just dissent and places like that. Whereas if you have this utopian zeal that you see in communism, it inevitably devolves into tyranny. It always comes out as tyranny. And the death toll is, if you look at the death toll of the 20th century, it's 100 million or so. It's just insane.
Yeah, no, amen. So Tim, can you walk through for us really the way Marxism has developed over the last 100 years, especially that trail of tears, if you will, that sort of trail of oppression and murder? Because again, I think a lot of people, when they think of Marxism or communism, they don't really have that full perspective. They don't associate Marxism with all the murder and all the loss of life through the last 100 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. It is one of those things where we're coming up on the anniversary of 9/11, but we're also here in a few weeks will be 32 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think that a lot of people, it's been a full generation. This is a whole generation that knew not Joseph. In this case, they knew not communism. They didn't see what happened. They didn't hear the reports of the people coming over. And you see the memes on Facebook or whatever that, so-and-so's a socialist, whatever. And then someone, it says everyone from Eastern Europe is just giving them a dirty look just because they experienced it. And actually here at the Colson Center, I'm going to be writing up a script for a breakpoint that is talking about why Marx gets a pass. Why it is that you see that Hitler's rightly seen as this awful person. You read the accounts, it's stomach turning. But that Stalin and Mao, who sadly killed even more people, oppressed even more people. Around 1952, they nearly a third of the world they controlled. A third of the world's population was under their thumb. And they get a pass. You still occasionally on college campuses, you see pictures of Mao. Not so much Stalin for some good reasons, though occasionally you do, sadly. And they get a pass. Marx gets a pass. And no one would think of having a picture. I mean, if someone had a picture of Hitler on the wall, they would very quickly and rightly be fired. So why does Marx get a pass? Why do the communists get a pass? One of the reasons is because Hitler's empire ended in ashes. It was crushed. The Red Army marched in and leveled Berlin. You could see the city, the burnt out cities of Cologne, of all these German cities, and the devastation. And so there was a repudiation. Whereas Stalin and Mao, they died in their beds. Stalin, I mean, they died of various diseases and whatnot. They had some hard lives, but they died in their beds. And so there was never this sense of repudiation. And so you don't see that. I don't think people are aware of it. Even those who are aware of times of the Cold War. They forget that. When I was 14, we went to Berlin. This was in 88, so a year before the wall came down. And it was astonishing to see, even as an American who grew up, I grew up watching all the Cold War movies, Red Dawn, Wolverines, and all that good stuff, right? But you go there and you see the Berlin Wall, and you see that you've got guys with hand trucks with mirrors on the bottom to see if someone has escaped from his own country into freedom. Because they're looking under the trains and under the buses and things like that. And you see that on the top of the wall, there was this, it wasn't just a flat wall like this, perpendicular, but had a large circular thing on top, so broad that you couldn't get a handhold to pull yourself over. And you got to wonder about a society that has a significant portion of its armed forces pointing their guns at their own people. That should tell you something about a society. And you read the stories of Solzhenitsyn, you read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, you read these stories and the persecution they go under. And it's one of those things where you read it, and if you know your history, the story doesn't end well, because these people are not going to make it out because they're Christians in a hostile atheist state, and they're ethnically German. So they don't end well. Their story does not end well. And it's heartbreaking because you see the oppression. You read the accounts of the famine in China between 1958 and 1962, with Mao's attempts to kind of create this utopia. And the estimates are something like 40 million people died. Now, that's not execution, but it's communist policy leading to tens of millions of people dying. And you don't see the stories. You see the college students with Che Guevara on their shirts. And I think you need to read a little bit about him.
Yeah, right.
And I think the fundamental problem is,
and that was awful. That was my next question is, when you hear about the carnage, that Marxism and communism have left behind over the years, what is the cause of the broad appeal here in 2021 with socialism light? Or often you say, well, yeah, they just did it wrong. Or, what is the appeal? Is it more of a messaging of, the oppressor versus the oppressed type messaging that, they don't want to see what's going on in the poor. They don't want to acknowledge our existence. And if you don't want to acknowledge it, we're going to force you to. Like, what is it? Message? What is it?
I think the answer to the question is yes. All of what you just said, a lot of it is messaging. Communism, sharing, that sounds good. That sounds wonderful, appealing. Dignity. They talk about recompense to the evildoer. Again, that sounds very minor prophets. Down with the unjust rulers and things like that. There is that appeal, but also again, part of it is the messaging. I don't know if you've seen there's a British comedy skit where these two SS officers on the Eastern Front in Russia, they have this discussion as to whether or not they're the baddies because they realize they have skulls on their hats. Okay, the Nazis looked bad. They sounded bad. They're all about hatred and all this kind of stuff. Did they try to look bad? So that's part of the problem. But you look at, socialist realism art, the paintings, the posters that you see, and all these pictures from Soviet Russia, and they all look dignified, looking off under the horizon. And it sounds so wonderful. It sounds so beautiful. And I think there's something appealing about that. I think that communism also, because far more so than fascism or Nazism were, it's an all-encompassing worldview. And I think this is where a lot of Christians go wrong. When you read the accounts of people like Carl F. H. Henry and Francis Schaeffer, when they're talking about communism, they're not talking about a different political party. They're not even talking about a different governmental system like a monarchy or an aristocracy or something like that. They're talking about a fundamental worldview, an all-encompassing worldview that's hostile, overly hostile. And when you read when they talk about these things, people look back at the Cold War Christians and say, oh, they got carried away, they were just being nationalistic. It's like, no, when you read what they said, they didn't oppose communism because communism fought America. They supported America because America fought communism. It was the reverse. Right. They didn't see the opposite number of communism to be the United States. They saw the opposite of communism to be Christianity. It was a completely rival system to explain. Because think about it, it has prophets. Marx, he's got the prophet's beard. It's got this explanation. It has holy texts of Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital and all in Mao's little red book. It has saints. There's no afterlife, but there's almost a functional afterlife because you get to be a hero of the Soviet Union. You get to be taking part in the struggle. And I think so it gets, people want that. I mean, listen to the Soviet national anthem. It is a beautiful piece of music. It's stirring. You want to join in, and there's something powerful about that.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's kind of a cynical, this is my cynical take. One reason that people like communism is because you don't have to question your own motives. Because if you're one of the good guys, then you're working for the revolution. You're working for the good that's coming. And that means, you might not be an extremist and want to put people in death camps, but it means you don't have to pay attention to whether or not you're treating the other guy well, because he's the enemy and you could destroy him. There's no concept of loving your enemy. I mean, that might be the fundamental difference for all the talk about community, and Christianity. There's no love your neighbor. There's no.
No, that's what 100. That's a lot of times, and I love that. I'll use that same thing that the opposite of Marxism, of communism, isn't capitalism. It's Christianity. Right. And what I'll oftentimes, especially when I'm talking with college groups, I'll say, Christianity. We are taught that Christianity radically values the individual, made in the image of God, someone of infinite value and infinite importance, and that it matters no matter who they are or where they come from. Whereas communism, Marxism cares about the collective. It's about the group, and where that what I'll use to sort of compare and contrast is that Christianity teaches us that we leave the 99 to pursue the one, that one person matters so much. Whereas communism teaches that you kill the one to protect the 99.
Yeah, because the group is all that matters.
The group is what matters. And so the individual liberty, the individual rights, that's where you're seeing today the rise, the rise of the conversation around, is religious freedom actually a good thing? Is free speech actually a good thing? And that, and I'll say too, over the last few months, I've done a lot more debates around critical race theory. And as you mentioned, it's got Marxist roots. Is it Marxism? No, but it's got Marxist roots. And, I think I'd put Marxism, in this, because critical race theory and critical theory generally has the same aspect to it, which, when you really, if you read them charitably and you really try to understand what the folks that perpetuate these worldviews or these systems think through, you kind of come around to this is a secular and an anti-God or a godless attempt to understand a broken world, right? To make sense of why is there sin, make sense of the problem of evil.
Yeah, what is the source of our pain?
Right. Yeah. And they're when you don't have God and the creation, fall, redemption, restoration narrative, you end up in this, this is one of the paths you end up going down of trying to explain why is the world so broken. Right. So Tim, can we dive into that a little bit further of, so we see all the suppression that comes out of communism, that's plain for the world to see, plain in the history books for the world to see. So what is it in the worldview of communism that leads to that? What's the root that eventually leads to this toxic plant?
Well, I think you've hit on some of it there. We've mentioned it a little bit already. It's the sense of the eschaton is coming and it's inevitable, and the individual doesn't matter. It's the group. It's like the ends justify the means entirely, because your dignity, your identity is entirely tied up in your place in the revolution. If you're some poor Russian minor nobility in 1920, you're going to die, whether you've done anything or not. You look at the Cultural Revolution in the late 60s in China, and these people, some of whom had worked for the communists, all of a sudden, because they had their grandparents had been, a business owner or something like that, they end up with being tortured and killed and all sorts of things like that. The absolute loyalty, it inevitably leads to that. And I think also there's a question of a simplistic epistemology. I remember. I think it was about 89. I was at a Labrie Fellowship conference, and an American nuclear physicist was talking to us about the difference between communist worldview and Christian worldview. And he was talking about nuclear power. And he was talking about Chernobyl Now, at that time, it wasn't very much earlier. I guess it was about 92. So it was this, so about 8 years or 6 years earlier, when Chernobyl had happened. And he noted that if you go to an American or British nuclear power plant, there's rule books and guidelines galore, just rows and rows and rows of procedures. You go to the Soviet Union, and there was like one binder. And the key was, in the communist mentality, the only way you make a mistake, if you're properly educated, is if you intentionally do it. So they had no backup procedures. So there was a Chernobyl movie that came out like last year, whatever. I still haven't seen much of it.
I'll just say the Chernobyl miniseries, it needs to be required watching in every school, because it just shows what communism does to a society.
And I heard they didn't pull any punches about that. Unexpected about that.
Right. Yeah.
But you hear stories about that dissidents in communist countries down through the ages, that if someone's up to something, they throw them in an insane asylum, in a mental hospital. And at first I thought, okay, well, that's got to be just they're trying to shame them. And that's probably a lot of it. But I think in part of the communist mentality, they actually thought they were crazy, because how could you turn away from the goodness of communism? The only way you could turn away from it is because you had something wrong in your head. Either you're malicious, or you're ignorant, or you were mentally unbalanced. And if you get rid of the maliciousness, perhaps, and you get rid of the uneducated, the only thing you're left with is mentally unbalanced. And so I think that because they saw the world as clearly this is the right way, if you opposed them, you had to be either crazy, uneducated, or malicious. And one of those three things ends up in a very bad place.
Yeah. So, Tim, I want to bring this now to a pastor's perspective. For a pastor that is seeing a rise in embracing of a communist worldview, embracing of a Marxist worldview, maybe even embracing of critical theory, things like that. Where from I mentioned the sheep and that aspect of it. Where do you see Marxism becoming and communism becoming completely incompatible with what the Bible teaches, with what Christians should believe?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we've already touched on it already. The love your enemy. It's not just love your neighbor. It's not just love the member of your class, or if you get to more contemporary versions, love the member of your sexual identity group, love the member of your racial group, love the member of your whatever. It's love your enemies. And that is a radical concept that communism, and I would say much of critical theory, has no place for.
From the pastor side of things, I think you touched on it just here briefly. I feel like it's not just those that are not Christians that don't understand love. I don't think that Christians understand love anymore. And so it's so much easier for us to bite on something that is a pseudo love, that you don't see my pain, they do. You don't care that we're struggling, or there's this disparities within the community, but they do.
Yep.
It's so I think the counterfeit message of love is one that is a lot stronger and resonating a lot more with this younger generation than even the true love message that the church should be espousing. So, for me, I focus on the messaging. I understand the theories, but for me is most people that I'm working with, most people that we advocate for don't understand all the theories. They don't understand critical race theory, but they ride for it. They're advocating for it because of the sound, because of the message of love that they hear, even though it's a counterfeit love.
Right. The dignity.
Right. Yeah. It sticks. And I don't know if you could speak to that. I don't know if there's a solution in there, but I think sometimes when we try to tear down the theory without really focusing on how to, if they're telling the lie, then how do we tell the truth better?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I think that this might be going backwards, but one of the criticisms I would offer, or narratives I would try and spin for someone who's embraced these things, it's like C.S. Lewis's talk about mud pies on the seashore. That you're sitting here playing with a mud pie when there's the truth of the seashore. You're sitting here talking about these fully inadequate understandings of human life and society and goodness and rightness, and you don't understand. There's so much more. There's so much more. There is love. There is humility. All of these things that you see in communism, that you see in critical theory, that are appealing, that's good. There's more. There's so much. There's more coming along.
Right.
But I think that one of the questions that the church has to ask itself, particularly, kind of elite evangelicalism, and they are asking it to some degree, I just don't think they're asking it all that well sometimes, is what impression have we been giving to people, ethnic minorities, poor, women, whatever, that they don't feel this love, that they don't see it. And I think that's a failure of the church, that we have not been properly living out the gospel. We have not been, the solution for the Christians is to be Christians. The solution for the Christians is to do, there's the line from Emperor Julian the Apostate, complaining that the Christians, he tried to kind of emulate the Christians in the way, in kind of reviving paganism and having them care for the poor. But he complained that the Christians not only cared for their own poor, but for other people's poor as well. That'd be a nice complaint for people to have for us. If we could, if the church spoke, we have the answer. We have the answers to why it is that someone, African American, who feels oppression, who feels undignified by people around him, or particularly looking back in history or even to the present, we have the answers to why he's right to feel angry about that. We have the answer that he's made in the image of God, and that any desecration, whether it's a full-on physical desecration like in centuries ago, or present just dignity issues, we have the answer rooted in the image of God. And we're not saying it very well sometimes. And I think that the best thing we can do is, this is going to be one of those, actions speak louder than words. We have to have the words. That's my job, to come up with the words. Yeah. But those words must flow out into the way we treat people and the way we're proclaiming and showing the inadequacy of critical theories and communism and things like that.
Well, Tim Padgett from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, resident theologian at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. That's a great place to wrap it up. Grateful for you being with us. Tim, any places for folks who want to get connected with Colson Center? Where should they go? What should they do?
Oh, goodness. Well, the simplest thing, go to breakpoint.org. That's going to have our website. They'll have links to everything. Or you can go to, I think it's just colsoncenter.org. But if you just look up us online, we have several sort of resources you can look for, whether it's daily sort of dose things like breakpoints and points, whether it's podcasts with a certain someone special to you.
Yeah, you got a few good writers over there.
Exactly.
My wife on the Breakpoint podcast.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, so there's lots of resources there, and we're hoping to continue to build more into that kind of opportunity.
That's great. Hey, Tim, thanks for joining us. And thanks, everyone, for listening to episode 1 of Volume 2 on Marxism here on The Narrative. We'll be back next week.